So in order to accomplish or to test for session hijacking during the pen test environment, the pen tester should try to locate, obviously, a session, right? And he's not going to look for just one particular session. He'll look for several different types of sessions that may be going across the network. So I asked the question, how do you accomplish this? Well, this could actually vary depending on not only the devices, but also the network and its infrastructure that's being used for communication. Typically, we'd start off with just doing some basic packet sniffing. After we locate a session, we would check whether the URL uses a session ID. If it does, then we'd check to see if the session is encrypted. If the session ID is not used in the URL, then we actually have to sniff sessions between two targets. And we can use tools like Wireshark or WinDump or even the Microsoft Network Monitoring tool. Now, once we find a session between two targets, we're going to check to see if it's encrypted. If it's encrypted, we would just abort the session and then maybe use a Trojan to perform a session hijack. If it isn't encrypted, then we try to see if we can get a hold of the session ID or if it's recoverable. Now, if you're not able to recover the session ID from the unencrypted session, we could use tools like OWASP's ZAP, which is the Z attack proxy, or Burp Suite, or JHijack. So our next step would be then to see if the session ID is URL encoded. It could actually be URL encoded, HTML encoded, Unicode encoded, base64 encoded, hex encoded, and I may have left out a couple of other different types of encoding, but basically if it is, we want to see if we can crack that session ID. Again, usually the session IDs are responsible for authenticating your users. If you're able to actually recover the session ID of an authenticated user, all you have to do then is inject yourself between the victim's machine and the remote machine and use this unauthorized connection for your own purposes, or in this case here, testing to see if it can be done. Now, if by chance you're successful at cracking the session ID encryption, or you can actually use this if the session ID isn't encrypted, we could send an email to several users within the organization with a phishing scam associated to it. So they click on a link that we've sent them because, hey, if you want a free Xbox, click here, might entice them to click on that link. Now, the next step, whether or not we are able to crack the session ID encryption, would be to try sending out some phishing emails out to users within the organization to see if they'll click on some of the links that you've developed for a fixation attack. Now, if the users actually fall for a fixation attack, it makes our job a lot easier. Oh, Dale, what do you mean by it'll be easier for us? Well, if they've fallen for that fixation attack, we can then go through and actually make a connection to their systems and access the machine remotely just by masking ourselves as an authorized user of the network. And once we've done that, we can go through a couple of other steps. That would be obviously to go through and collect different session IDs or several session IDs. Now, you can either do this from a cookie in a response header or by matching regular expressions against the response body. After we've collected several session IDs, the next step would be then to break out our crystal balls and see if we can predict the new session ID, because we should see a pattern based off all these session IDs that we've collected. Now, if we're able to predict the new session ID and find out what the current session ID is, then we can engage in a replay attack. Upon further review of the play, it's been determined that the target was pwned. So that would be our next step, is actually doing a replay of the new session ID. And how this takes place is that we just simply copy the stream of the message or the session IDs between the two parties and then replay that stream to one or more party. Now, if the target isn't protected, then it will actually accept the stream as a legitimate session. So all we would have to do is check to see if we established a connection. If you're able to create that session, then obviously the target is susceptible. Now, another step that we could try to implement would also include trying a brute force attack. Yeah, listen to me now, hear me later, understand me next week. I know I need to lay off the tanning bed, huh? Brute force, all we're doing is exactly what it sounds like, is we're going to try all possible ranges of values for a session ID until we actually get the correct one. Now, this does involve us making thousands of requests using all the randomly generated session IDs, but it's very time consuming, so it's typically used as a last resort. Now, regardless of how we're able to, or if we're able to implement this type of an attack in our pen test, you all know what the next step is, right? Dale, that would be documentation. That's right. You guys are used to this one over and over. Again, we're going to document all of our findings at each step of our pen test within this environment. And we're going to use this again for analysis and also future references.